Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today, while I'm waiting on some parts that I need for the AW4 swap that I'm working on, I thought it would be fun to go over some common questions I get about my Kubota diesel-powered TJ Wrangler, and I also want to go over some things that I actually would have done differently if I were to do this project all over again. So, with that said, let's get to the first question. The number one question I get is, what is the engine that I'm using, how much power does it make, and what is it out of? The engine I'm using is a V2403 turbo diesel engine from Kubota, and it is an indirect injection. Now, the more common engine, and the one I would actually recommend if you're interested in doing this swap, is the V2203 direct injection that is most commonly found in carrier units. The direct injection actually makes about 15% more power, both in horsepower and torque, than the indirect inject. So a 2203 direct inject will actually make more horsepower and torque than my V2403 indirect inject. The second question I get asked a lot is, how much power and torque does this engine make? So to answer that in a way that makes sense is, we're going to first talk about how much power it makes with no turbos. Stock, this is about 48 to 50 horsepower and about 105 to 110 foot-pounds of torque. Now, with the turbo, about every 14.7 psi of boost it sees, you double those figures. So when I'm running 15 psi of boost, that 50 horsepower becomes 100 horsepower, but more importantly, that 110 foot-pounds of torque becomes 220 foot-pounds of torque, and that's down low. Peak torque on the 4-liter, the stock engine that came in this, was 3,200 RPM. Whereas peak torque on this motor is more around 1,800 to 2,200 RPM. So you hit that peak torque way lower. You really want to drive this setup with the torque, not the horsepower. With that said, there is still more boost to be had out of this turbo. The turbo I'm using is a Borg-Warner KO3. It can produce up to around 25 psi of boost, meaning my horsepower and torque, or my max peak horsepower and torque, should be around 135 to 145 horsepower, but peak torque should be around 300 foot-pounds of torque. Again, well below 3,000 RPM, anywhere between 1,800 and 2,200 RPM, which is fantastic for both on-road driving and wheeling off-road, because you have all that torque available to you down low. The third part of the most common question I get is, what is this engine out of? Truthfully, I don't know what this specific engine is out of. The guy I bought it from on Facebook got it in trade, and it had already been pulled. Again, like I'd already said earlier, the most common one is the V2203 DI, or direct injection, and those are commonly found out of reefer units. You can find them on eBay all day long. I see them for about 1,500 bucks. I'm now seeing them on Facebook actually pretty regularly too. So if you want to do this swap, get the V2203 direct inject. You'll have more horsepower and torque than I do, and it will just be easier to find. I just got really lucky with finding this one. The next most common question I get on this swap is, what transmission are you running? So the transmission I'm running is an AW4 4-speed automatic out of the XJ Cherokee. And unbeknownst to me, when I first started doing this swap, there are actually two types. You have a 21 spline that has a 0.705 overdrive, and then you have a 23 spline 0.75 overdrive AW4. The one I had put in my Wrangler was an early model 21 spline with a 0.705 overdrive. This past weekend I picked up this one here. This is a 23 spline output. It's out of a 1999 Jeep Cherokee. It has 170,000 miles. It works, and this is going to be what we are switching to. I also now have a heavy duty torque converter. It is not a low stall torque converter, because that's the other issue that I think I'm running into currently with this whole swap, is the torque converter in the transmission that I have been running is a low stall torque converter. So we're switching to a higher gear ratio and overdrive, and the stall speed is also going to be higher, but the torque converter itself is heavy duty, so it should be able to take all the torque that this diesel engine is going to be producing. The other reason why I went with an AW4 automatic out of all of the transmission options available to me for this swap was cost. I really love these AW4 automatics because they are dirt cheap. You can pick one up running all day long under $200. You might have to travel a little bit, but they're always dirt cheap. It's a great transmission. Yes, they have some known issues, but if you put a shift kit in it, you cool it properly, and you just make sure the TV cable is adjusted correctly, because this is what applies more hydraulic pressure to the gears. They're actually a really good transmission. And for me, it was cost. I was trying to do this diesel swap as cheaply as possible. And the AW4 automatic kind of checked all the boxes that I needed it to check. I needed an overdrive, I needed something cheap, and I wanted something that would bolt up to my MP231 transfer case. The next most common question I've been getting is, what's that attached to the rear of your automatic transmission? And that would be my EcoBox doubler from Northwest Fab. Now, this is a doubler that you have to assemble yourself with the parts from an MP231. I really like this unit, and it allows you to do really 3 things very uniquely. One, you get to have a 2-wheel drive low range. Now, there are kits for the MP231 where you can have a 2-wheel drive low range. I prefer this setup better. I'm a little bit biased. I've never run the other setup, but I also like the other capabilities you get with the doubler, and having that 2-wheel drive low range where you can crawl really slowly but still go lock to lock on steering without binding anything in the front axle is really awesome when you're going through tight areas. The second thing it gives you is 2 different ways to get into 4 low. Now with this, to be in 4 low, I can either have this in low range and my transfer case in 4 high, or I can have this in high range and my transfer case in 4 low. They both have the same speed because they are the same ratio, so both 2.72 to 1. And finally, my favorite thing about the doubler is when I'm in double low range. I have the doubler in low, and I have my transfer case in 4 low. It gives me a crawl ratio of 7.4 to 1. And it is just so slow. It's amazing. And for what I like doing, and again, the type of wheeling I enjoy, having that finite control of even giving the diesel engine a lot of throttle, you don't jump in speed. It does go faster, but it's not a lot faster. But when you're trying to descend a steep hill, because I have a shift kit in my transmission, I can leave my shifter in first gear, use the compression from the engine to slow down everything, and I can just crawl down a slippery surface and not lose traction at the tire like you would if you tried applying the brakes. It really is one of my favorite things about that doubler. So the last question I've been getting a lot recently, especially with my troubles going 55 miles per hour, is why did I not consider re-gearing my axles or going to a different tire size? And really there are 3 reasons for that. Number 1, changing the transmission and the torque converter was the cheapest way to try to solve this problem currently. The torque converter was $150 and some change, and this transmission was $100. Again, it's one of the reasons why I went with an AW4 automatic. They're dirt cheap. So the second part is, why didn't I re-gear? Re-gearing would actually help me in a lot of cases. Unfortunately, I'm always going to have that 30% drop from 3rd gear to 4th gear with the AW4 that I was running. And re-gearing is only going to move that gap around. It's not going to change the fact that it's a 30% overdrive. Going to this new AW4, I'm going down to a 25% overdrive. So yes, re-gearing would help, and at some point I do want to re-gear this. But re-gearing this right now is both very expensive and it won't fix the problem I'm running into. Now on to the fun stuff. What have I learned and wish I had known before I started this whole swap? And honestly, having to swap transmissions is the biggest thing. I really didn't do my research at the time. I didn't know there were two types of AW4s. I did know there was a 21 spline and a 23 spline, but I didn't realize that the overdrive gears were different. The other thing I wish I had known was more about torque converters. At the time, I really thought, oh hey, it's a diesel engine. The lower stall torque converter I can find, the better my life will be, the better the performance I'll have. And that's really not true. My low stall speed torque converter is actually the cause of a lot of heat that I'm generating in the engine. It's putting a ton of load in the engine right now. And by actually going to a stock stall converter, but heavy duty so it can take the torque, more than likely I'm going to be able to add more fuel and more boost to my diesel engine and get more horsepower and torque out of it. Another great question I've been asked very recently is, what's one thing you've done with this swap that you would do again? And aside from what I would say is diesel engine, I would have to say is the brakes. When I first got the diesel engine running, I had an electric vacuum pump supplying vacuum to my vacuum brake booster, and it was okay when you were in high range. If you were in low range, it kind of stopped the Jeep, and if you were in double O range, the diesel engine would just push right through the brakes. Like, you could not stop the Jeep at all. Thankfully, you were going slow enough, it kind of didn't matter, but to really stop it, you had to pull it in neutral, and then you could stop. Going to that Hydro Boost setup was the best upgrade I've ever had on this TJ Wrangler. The amount of clamping force it applies to the brakes is incredible. Right now, this TJ Wrangler, which has drum brakes in the rear, can outbrake my LJ Rubicon, which is disc brakes both on the front and rear. That really is an upgrade that I'm considering doing to all of my Jeeps. It's just the amount of braking force you get is incredible. The final question I've been asked, which I think is a really interesting one, is if you could do one thing differently on your build, what would you do? And for me, I think it's the one thing that really makes this build stand out is I would have not gone with a doubler. And I know that seems kind of odd. I love the doubler. I have nothing bad to say for it. But what I didn't take into account when I was doing this swap was the amount of modifications it was going to take to run the doubler. I had to move the engine 6.5 inches forward to make up for the 7 inches that doubler is in length. I also went to a super short slip yoke eliminator, which also helped with length, because anyone that owns a TJ knows that rear drive shaft is really short. But by moving the engine forward, I really hurt myself on terms of intercoolers. It's part of the reason why I went with a water-to-air setup. I couldn't fit a massive air-to-air intercooler in the front of my grill without completely tearing up and cutting my front grill, which I really didn't want to do. But yeah, if I could have done it again, I would have not gotten the doubler. I would have just gone an MP241 OR transfer case out of a Rubicon. Because the other thing is, I could have left my interior stock, which would have saved me so much time. Right now I have a Genrite aluminum console, I have a Winter's Car shifter for the AW4, and I have a beautiful set of transfer case shifters from JB Custom Fabrications. And they're beautiful, I love them, I love the etching on the top, they really are great. But all that stuff added time and, more importantly, money to the swap. If I'd gone with the MP241 OR, I could have adapted my stock gear selector to my AW4, and I could have just gotten a cable selector for the MP241, and I would have been done. And truthfully, with the amount of torque this diesel engine produces, a 4-to-1 transfer case I would have been just as happy with. Now again, I love my doubler. I'm not getting rid of it. I think it really makes this Jeep special, and for what I want to do with this Jeep, I think it's going to let me do some pretty impressive things, considering I'm only running a 31.8 inch tire. But if I were to do this again, I would have not gone with the doubler. It would have saved me a ton of time on the swap. And oddly enough, I think the only other thing I would have done differently is I wouldn't have built a right-hand drive TJ, as odd as that sounds. I really love my right-hand drive. I love that it's orange. Orange is my favorite color. and I've always had a fascination with postal Jeeps. But the right-hand drive has presented some very unique challenges. There have been specific parts that I've had to replace or try to figure out, and having that on the right-hand drive has just not been easy. Alright everyone, that's all I have for this video. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for all the comments. I try to read all of them. I've really tried to respond to all of them, and I really appreciate it. It really has helped me learn and expand my skill set with this entire build. So anyway, it's YouTube. You know what to do. Take out more than you bring, tread lightly, and I'll see you soon. Goodbye.